The shriek of steel on the steel was the first sound of Red Bluff, Wyoming, a raw, scraping cry that tore through the frozen air. It was a sound of arrival and of warning. The train, a great black beast panting clouds of steam, slowed its churning pistons and hissed to a stop alongside a long wooden platform slick with a gathering of early snow. The flakes were not the soft, gentle kind that promised a peaceful winter blanket. They were small and hard, driven by a wind that had the bite of a cornered animal. They swirled in gray eddies, landing on the raw timber of the platform and the shoulders of the waiting men, melting into a grimy slush that mirrored the color of the sky. From the relative warmth of the passenger car, Clara Whitmore watched the town reveal itself. It was less a town and more a collection of buildings huddled together for survival against the vast, empty expanse of the plains. Unpainted storefronts with stark lettering, General Mercantile, Saloon, Assayer, lined a single, wide street of churned mud that was already beginning to freeze into hard, treacherous ruts. There was no softness here, no gentle curve of a church steeple or the welcoming green of a town square. There was only wood and mud and the endless, oppressive gray of the sky. Her gloved hands, thin and worn, tightened on the handle of her small carpet bag. Inside it, beside her few belongings, was the crumpled letter that had served as her map and her courage for the 1,000-mile journey. Taking a deep, unsteady breath, she stepped down from the train, her worn leather shoes sinking slightly into the wet snow on the steps. The cold was a physical shock, a slap that stole her breath and made the fabric of her thin wool dress feel as useless as paper. It was a good dress, her best one, a sensible dark blue she had mended herself, but it had been made for the damp chill of a Pennsylvania autumn, not the dry, bone-deep freeze of a Wyoming winter. She felt the eyes of the town on her before she even looked up. A small cluster of people had gathered to meet the train, their faces pinched and ruddy from the cold. The women were wrapped in heavy shawls and thick coats, their expressions a mixture of weary curiosity and sharp, immediate judgment. Their eyes traveled from Clara's inadequate dress to her pale, city-bred face, to the hopeful, nervous tension in her posture. Whispers, like the rustle of dry leaves, passed between them. They saw not a person, but a category, a mail-order bride, a woman who had traveled across the country for a man she had never met, a woman driven by a desperation they could only guess at and privately condemn. The men were different, but no better. A few rough-looking prospectors and ranch hands lingered near the saloon doors across the street, their gazes more direct, more invasive. A smirk passed between two of them, a silent, crude appraisal that made a hot flush of shame crawl up Clara's neck, a warmth that did nothing to combat the cold. Even the children, bundled to their eyes in scarves, stopped their games to stare, their expressions blank with the unabashed curiosity of the young. She was a spectacle, a strange new creature deposited into their harsh, isolated world. Clara ignored them as best she could, her heart hammering against her ribs with a frantic rhythm. She scanned the faces on the platform, searching for the one described in the letters. "I am a man of plain features," Walter Hensley had written in his neat, deliberate script. "Tall, with hair the color of corn silk that has seen much sun, and blue eyes that are accustomed to long distances. You will know me by the steadiness of my gaze." But among the weathered, bearded faces that watched her, there was no one with hair like corn silk. There were glances, some curious, some contemptuous, but none that held the promised steadiness. There was only the shifting, anonymous gaze of the crowd. The conductor called out his final boarding call, his voice swallowed by the wind. Passengers disembarked, greeted by family with rough hugs and quiet words. Cargo was unloaded with loud thumps onto the platform. The life of the station swirled around her for a brief, chaotic moment. And then, just as quickly, it began to dissolve. Families trudged away, their boots crunching in the slush. Men carried crates into the mercantile. The crowd thinned, leaving only the lingerers and the watchers, and Clara. She stood by her bag, forcing her posture to remain straight, a small island of stillness in the biting wind. He was simply late, she told herself. A horse could have thrown a shoe. A stray calf could have wandered off. There were 1,000 reasons for a man to be delayed in a land this vast. The certainty of this conviction felt strong for the first hour, a small, warm coal in the pit of her stomach. She watched the street, expecting at any moment to see a tall, fair-haired man on horseback riding toward her, his face etched with apology. The first hour bled into the second. The wind grew more insistent, plucking at the hem of her dress and sending icy tendrils up her sleeves. The snowflakes fell thicker, clinging to her dark hair and melting on her cold cheeks. The warmth in her stomach flickered and died, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. The men outside the saloon had not moved, and their occasional glances felt heavier now, weighted with a knowing mockery. The whispering women had retreated into the warmth of the mercantile, but Clara could still feel the phantom sting of their judgment. By the third hour, a deep, penetrating chill had settled into her bones. Her feet were numb inside her thin shoes, and her fingers, even inside her gloves, ached with a painful cold. The hope that had sustained her across a continent was starting to feel flimsy, naive. She pulled the letter from her pocket, her fingers stiff and clumsy as she unfolded the creased paper. The ink was slightly blurred, the words she had memorized now seeming like a foreign language. I have a good ranch, a sturdy house. I can offer you security and a respectable life. I am a man of my word. Was he? Or was she the victim of a cruel joke? A foolish girl who had sold her last remaining possessions and traded her life for a collection of lies written on cheap paper? A cold, hard lump of fear formed in her throat. The station agent, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression named Jebediah, began to lock up the ticket office. He had been casting uneasy glances her way for the last hour. Now, he shuffled over, his boots making a squelching sound in the slush, and cleared his throat. Miss, he said, not quite meeting her eyes, the next train ain't till Thursday. I'm not waiting for a train, Clara replied, her voice thinner than she intended. I'm meeting someone, Mr. Walter Hensley. Jebediah's gaze finally met hers, and what she saw there, a quick, uncomfortable flicker of pity, sent a fresh wave of dread through her. He shifted his weight. Well, he ain't come yet, has he? It's getting dark and colder. You can't stay out here. He will be here, she insisted, clutching the letter as if it were a shield. I cannot leave. He will not know where to find me. The station agent sighed, a plume of white vapor leaving his lips. Look, miss, I'm closing up the telegraph office. You can wait inside there for a bit. It's warm by the stove. His offer was clumsy, born more from a desire to salve his own conscience than from genuine compassion. He didn't want to be the man who left a woman to freeze on his platform. For a moment, the temptation was immense. The thought of warmth, of escaping the relentless wind and the stairs, was a siren's call. But her fear was stronger. What if this was a test? What if Mr. Hensley arrived to find an empty platform and thought her an unreliable, flighty woman? Her entire future depended on this meeting. She had to be here. Thank you, sir, but I must wait here, she said, her teeth beginning to chatter. I am sure he is just delayed. Jebediah shrugged. His duty done. Suit yourself, he muttered, and retreated into the small office, the click of the lock echoing in the quiet air. The sun, which had been a pale, disinterested wafer in the sky all day, finally gave up and bled away behind the distant, jagged line of the mountains. The gray of dusk deepened into the bruised purple of a winter evening. One by one, lamps were lit in the windows of the town, casting feeble squares of yellow light onto the snowy street. The sound of a poorly played piano drifted from the saloon, a tinny, lonely melody that only seemed to amplify the silence. Night fell completely. The cold was no longer just an invading force. It was an occupying one. It was inside her, a solid block of ice in her chest. Her shivering was no longer a tremor but a violent, uncontrollable shudder that racked her entire body. She huddled on the hard wooden bench, pulling her thin coat tight, but it offered no protection. The melted snow on her dress had begun to stiffen, freezing to the wood beneath her. Tears she hadn't even been aware of holding back began to well in her eyes, hot at first, then instantly cold as they traced paths down her cheeks. They were tears of fear, of humiliation, of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing her down. She had failed. She had come all this way for nothing. She was alone, penniless, in a town that looked at her as if she were dirt on its boot. The crumpled letter in her hand was no longer a promise. It was the final, mocking testament to her own foolishness. Across the street, the bat-wing doors of the saloon swung open, spilling a brief torrent of rowdy laughter and warm light into the street before swinging shut again. A man stepped out, pausing for a moment on the boardwalk to turn up the collar of his coat against the wind. He was tall, his frame silhouetted against the saloon's glowing windows. He settled his hat lower on his brow and started to walk, his steps sure and quiet in the snow. His name was Elias Turner, and he was a man who preferred silence. He had been in the saloon for a drink, a single glass of whiskey to wash away the taste of a long day's work and the lingering chill of solitude. He had seen the woman when the train arrived, another hopeful, terrified face new to the unforgiving landscape, and like most of the town, he had guessed her purpose. He had seen it before. Sometimes they were met with awkward smiles and whisked away to a new life. Other times, they were not. He had seen that, too. He had assumed she would be gone by now, taken in by the preacher's wife, or offered a room at the boarding house. However, grudgingly. But as he crossed the street, his gaze fell on the train station, now dark except for the single lamp burning low on the post. And he saw her. She was still there, a small, dark shape huddled on the bench, almost indistinguishable from the shadows around her. She was not waiting anymore. She was enduring. He could see the violent tremors of her shivering even from across the street. He had seen cattle freeze in a blue norther with less agony. He had seen men, tough men, broken by a cold half as bitter as this. To leave a person out in it was a death sentence, delivered slowly. He stopped in the middle of the street, the saloon noise at his back and the vast, silent plains all around. The town had seen her. The women had whispered. The men had smirked. And the station agent had locked his door. Everyone had seen her, and everyone had walked away. A quiet, deep-seated anger stirred in his chest. It was an old, familiar feeling, a weariness with the casual cruelty of the world. Without a second thought, without a word to himself or to the biting wind, he changed his course and walked toward the station platform. His boots were heavy and silent on the fresh layer of snow. Clara did not hear him approach. She was lost in a fog of misery and cold. Her world shrunk to the violent shaking of her own body and the frozen tears on her face. She was only aware of a shadow falling over her, a sudden blocking of the dim lamplight. She flinched, expecting a harsh word, a crude proposition from one of the men she had seen earlier. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. But there was no word. Instead, there was a gentle weight, a surprising, life-altering warmth that settled over her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and clean, cold air. She opened her eyes. A worn, sheepskin-lined coat was draped around her, enveloping her in a cocoon of warmth so profound it was almost painful. Her head snapped up. The man stood before her, tall and silent. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could see the hard lines of his jaw, the deep-set eyes, the weathering of sun and wind etched into his skin. He was not smiling, nor was he frowning. His expression was one of quiet gravity. "You'll freeze out here," he murmured. His voice was low and soft, a gravelly sound that seemed to be pulled from the very earth beneath their feet. It was not an accusation or a question. It was a simple statement of fact. Clara stared up at him, startled into silence. Her shivering began to subside under the heavy warmth of the coat. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train, she saw something other than judgment, pity, or scorn. She saw a plain, unadorned kindness. It was a calm, steady light in his gaze, a compassion that asked for nothing and offered no solutions, but simply saw her. It saw her cold, her fear, her humanity. The moment felt small, suspended in the silent, snowy night. A cowboy, a coat, and a few quiet words. But in the desolate landscape of Clara's heart, it was everything. It was a hand reaching into the darkness, a quiet signal that she was not, after all, completely alone. It changed nothing about her situation, and yet it changed everything. He did not speak again. With a slight, almost imperceptible nod of his head, he gestured for her to follow. Clara, still wrapped in the heavy warmth of his coat, rose from the bench on legs that felt like brittle sticks. The world had a strange, dreamlike quality. The snow-muffled silence broken only by the crunch of his boots and the soft, unsteady whisper of her own footsteps behind him. He led her away from the desolate platform, across the wide, empty street, and toward a long, low building that smelled of hay and animals, the livery stable. The door creaked open on stiff hinges, revealing a cavernous space filled with the warm, living breath of horses. They shifted in their stalls, their soft snorts and the rustle of straw, a comforting, organic sound in the frozen night. A single lantern hung from a central beam, casting a soft, golden glow over the scene. In the corner, a pot-belly stove radiated a palpable heat, a welcome so profound it was almost a physical embrace. A young boy, no older than 15, sat on a stool, dozing with his chin on his chest. He startled awake as they entered. "Mr. Turner," the boy mumbled, scrambling to his feet. Elias just nodded at him. "Get back to sleep, Sam. Just need to get out of the wind for a minute." He guided Clara toward an overturned crate near the stove. "Sit," he said, his voice as quiet as it had been on the platform. Clara sank onto the crate, her body surrendering to the heat. She held her numb hands out to the stove, the feeling returning to them in a rush of painful pins and needles. Elias moved to the other side of the stove, not sitting, but standing with his back to the warmth, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his trousers. He was a sentinel, a silent, imposing figure in the dim light. Now that he was without his coat, she could see he wore a simple flannel shirt, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. He was giving her his warmth while he stood in the cold. The thought was so unexpected, so contrary to the hours of neglect she had just endured, that it made a fresh wave of tears threaten. They stayed that way for a long time, in a silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the gentle sounds of the horses. The heat from the stove slowly, painstakingly, began to push back the deep, cellular cold that had taken root in her. The violent shivering eased into a slight tremor, and she could finally breathe without her chest aching. It was the silence, strangely, that unlatched the words inside her. It was not an empty or an awkward silence. It was a patient silence, one that waited without demanding. "He was supposed to be here," she whispered, the words addressed to the glowing iron of the stove. "His name is Walter Hensley. He wrote to me for 6 months. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out the crumpled letter, her hands still clumsy but no longer numb. She didn't need to read it. She knew the words by heart. He said he had a ranch, a fine one, with a good herd and a sturdy house overlooking a creek. He said he needed a wife, someone of good character, to make a home. Elias remained silent, his gaze fixed on the fire. His stillness prompted her to continue, to fill the quiet space with the flimsy architecture of her hope. He sent money for the train ticket. He wrote about the mountains and the sky. He seemed like a good man, a lonely man. I was lonely too. Her voice cracked on the last word. My parents are gone. I worked as a seamstress in a dress shop, but the owner's son, I could not stay there. I had nothing left. Mr. Hensley's letters were a promise, a new life. She looked up at him then, her eyes pleading for some kind of confirmation, for him to say that yes, he knew of Mr. Hensley, and he was a good man, and there was surely a simple explanation for his absence. Elias's expression did not change, but a shadow seemed to pass through his eyes. He shifted his weight, and the leather of his boots creaked on the dusty floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and stripped of any emotion. I know the name, he said. He paused, and in that pause, Clara felt the last of her hope begin to crumble into dust. There is no Hensley Ranch anymore, not for the last month or so. Clara stared at him, uncomprehending. What do you mean? Walter Hensley was a man who preferred a deck of cards to a herd of cattle, Elias said, his words falling like stones into a deep well. He liked whiskey more than hard work. What little he had, his father left him. He spent most of his time in that saloon over there. He flicked his gaze toward the street. About a month back, he got into a poker game, bet the deed to his land on a single hand. He lost. The air left Clara's lungs in a silent rush. The stable, with its warm, living smells, suddenly felt like a tomb. He lost it? She whispered. Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod. The man who won it, a speculator from Cheyenne, sold it off within a week. As for Hensley, he got drunk, caused a stir in the saloon, swearing he'd been cheated. The sheriff gave him till sunrise to clear out of town. No one's seen him since. Most figure he drifted south, toward the gold fields, or maybe just drifted. Drifted. The word was so final, so dismissive. The man who had written of building a home, of needing a partner, of his steady gaze and plain features, was a phantom, a drunk, a gambler, a cruel liar who had summoned her across a continent to an empty platform and a life that did not exist. He hadn't been delayed. He had never intended to come at all. The last letter he sent her, the one with the ticket money, must have been his final, desperate gamble before he lost everything. The composure she had clung to for hours, for days, for the entire 1,000-mile journey, shattered like thin ice under a heavy stone. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of utter desolation. She doubled over, burying her face in her hands as the full, crushing weight of her reality crashed down upon her. The tears came in a hot, silent torrent. Tears of a grief so complete it had no sound. She had been so foolish, so naive. She had believed in promises whispered on paper from a man who was nothing more than a ghost. I sold everything, she choked out between sobs, the words muffled by her palms. My mother's locket. The only good quilt I owned. I have $4 and the clothes on my back. I have nowhere to go. Elias watched her, his face a mask of stone. Inside, he was at war with himself. He was a man who had built high, thick walls around his life, a fortress of solitude to protect what was left of his heart. He had his small cabin, his few cattle, and the ghosts of his past. He did not invite trouble. He did not get involved. This woman, crying by the stove in his coat, was trouble of the deepest kind. Her despair was a living thing in the small, warm space, and it called to a part of him he had thought long dead. To help her would be to invite complication, whispers, and worse, a connection to a world he had tried so hard to shut out. To turn his back on her, however, was impossible. He saw again the image of her on that bench, shivering, her tears freezing to her cheeks. He could not leave her to the mercy of a town that had none. He let out a long, slow breath. The decision, once made, settled in him with a heavy resignation. I have a cabin, he said, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth. It's north of town a few miles. It's small, but it's warm and dry. You can stay there until you figure out what to do next. Clara's head lifted, her face pale and streaked with tears. She stared at him through the watery blur, shock momentarily silencing her sobs. A stranger, a man who had just met her, was offering her shelter. After a day of being treated like a pariah, the offer was so staggering, so deeply kind, that she could not comprehend it. I cannot, she stammered. I am a stranger to you. It would not be proper. Proper left on the evening train, Elias said, his tone flat. There's the boarding house, but you said you have $4. That'll last you 2 nights. And then you'll be on the street. The preacher might take you in, but his wife will work you to the bone for your charity and look down her nose at you the entire time. You can stay in my cabin. It's a roof and a fire. That's all. His offer was not gentle. It was practical, stark, and stripped of sentiment. It was a choice between ruin and a different kind of ruin, and he was offering her the one that came with a roof. Clara, exhausted and with no other option left in the world, could only nod, a fresh wave of helpless tears tracing the old paths on her cheeks. The next morning, the world was a clean, blinding white. The snow had stopped, and a weak sun was doing its best to shine through a thin veil of clouds. The ride out of Red Bluff was an ordeal of silent humiliation. Elias had procured a gentle mare for her from the livery, and he rode beside her on his own sturdy gelding. Clara sat stiffly in the saddle, the borrowed sheepskin coat still wrapped around her, its unfamiliar weight a constant reminder of her circumstance. They did not go unnoticed. As they passed the mercantile, she saw the curtains in the window of the apartment above twitch. Mrs. Gable, the owner's wife, was watching. 2 men stopped their work loading a wagon to stare, their expressions a mixture of surprise and open speculation. They tipped their hats to Elias, but their eyes lingered on Clara with a cold, assessing curiosity. It was worse than the day before. Then, she had been a curiosity, an object of pity and scorn. Now, she was a scandal, the abandoned mail-order bride, riding out of town at dawn with the quiet, reclusive widower, Elias Turner. The story was writing itself in the minds of everyone who saw them, and she knew every word of it was ugly. They were nearly out of town when a woman emerged from a small, tidy house set back from the road. She was older, with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and a face that was all sharp angles and disapproval. She waved Elias down. "Martha," he greeted her, his voice carefully neutral as he reined in his horse. "Elias," she returned, her eyes darting to Clara for a fraction of a second before settling back on him. She wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture of domestic authority. "I see you found yourself some company." "She needed a place to stay," Elias said, his tone daring her to challenge him. Widow Martha James was not a woman easily cowed. She had been Elias's neighbor for 10 years, had known his late wife, and considered it her Christian duty to speak her mind. She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial, warning hiss. "Be careful, Elias. I know your heart is good, but you cannot fix what is already broken. No man can save a woman like that without ruin following. Her shame will stick to you like mud. The town is already talking." "Let them talk," Elias said, his voice cutting and cold. He nudged his horse forward, leaving the widow standing in the snow with her mouth pressed into a thin, grim line of disapproval. Clara felt a hot flush of shame burn her cheeks. A woman like that. The words echoed in her mind. It was what they all thought. She was not just unfortunate. She was tainted, ruined. The widow's warning had not been for her, but against her. She was a disease, and Elias was risking infection. The cabin was just as he'd said. Small. It was a single room, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs, with a stone fireplace at one end and a small sleeping loft at the other. It was impeccably clean, but starkly masculine. A rifle rested on pegs above the door. A set of worn books sat on a simple wooden shelf. The air smelled of pine, old smoke, and solitude. There was no sign of a woman's touch, no curtains on the single window, no rug on the rough plank floor. It was the home of a man who lived entirely within himself. At night, the isolation was absolute. The silence was deeper than any she had ever known, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the pines and, once, a sound that made the hair on her arms stand up, the distant, mournful howl of a wolf pack. The sound was wild, lonely, and predatory. Lying in the small bed in the loft, Elias had insisted. Taking a bedroll for himself by the hearth, Clara stared into the darkness and felt a fear colder than any she had felt on the platform. She had run from the subtle, suffocating cruelties of the city, only to find herself in a vast, untamed wilderness that felt just as hostile. Only its dangers had teeth. Had she made a mistake? Was it better to be slowly crushed by a world you knew than to be devoured by one you did not? Elias kept his distance. He was a constant, quiet presence, but he rarely spoke unless spoken to. He moved with a heavy economy, his actions deliberate and his face a stoic mask. He chopped wood, tended to his animals, and repaired a broken fence, his work a buffer between them. Clara understood. She was an intrusion in his carefully constructed solitude, a complication he had taken on out of a sense of duty she could not begin to repay. She saw the ghost in his eyes sometimes. When he stared into the fire, his gaze would go distant, and a deep, profound sadness would settle over his features, aging him a decade. She learned from a brief, clipped exchange with Sam, the stable boy, that Elias had lost his wife and young son in a house fire years ago. Right here on this very land, the knowledge settled a new layer of understanding over her. The emptiness of the cabin was not just a lack of things, it was a presence. It was shaped by loss. He was keeping his distance not just from her, but from the memory of a woman in his home, a family by his fire. After 2 days of suffocating silence and shared meals of biscuits and jerky, Clara found her voice. He was cleaning his rifle by the firelight. The metallic clicked sharp in the quiet room.
"Mr. Turner,"
she began, her own voice sounding rusty. He looked up, his hands stilling. "Elias." "Elias," she corrected herself softly. "I wanted to thank you. For the coat. For everything. You saved me." He looked down at the rifle parts in his hands, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He seemed to consider her words for a long moment before he answered, his voice a low murmur. "You looked colder than I've ever seen anyone look." It was not a dismissal of her thanks, nor was it an acceptance. It was a simple statement of fact, an explanation as practical and unadorned as the man himself. He had acted not out of heroism, but out of a basic, human response to profound suffering. He had seen her cold, and he had offered his coat. He had seen her desperation, and he had offered his home. Clara looked at him, at this quiet, haunted man who had shown her a kindness more profound than any she had ever known, and a small, watery smile touched her lips for the first time in days. "Still," she said, "thank you." He glanced up, and his eyes met hers across the small, warm space. For a fleeting second, the corner of his own mouth lifted in a faint, hesitant smile that did not quite reach his eyes but acknowledged her words all the same. The moment passed, and he returned his attention to his work. But something had shifted. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was no longer a heavy, awkward barrier, but a shared space, softened just a little around the edges. The small smiles they had shared were fragile things, easily lost in the days that followed. Winter, which had merely been a visitor before, now took up residence in the valley, settling in with the grim permanence of a tombstone. The snow fell relentlessly, not in soft, picturesque flakes, but in hard, driving sheets that buried the world in a silent, suffocating white. The wind was a constant predator, howling around the corners of the small cabin, rattling the single window in its frame, and searching for any crack in the chinking to send its icy fingers inside. The world shrank until it was composed only of the four walls of the cabin, the path to the lean-to that sheltered the animals, and the menacing snow-shrouded wall of the forest beyond. Life became a simple, brutal equation of survival, measured in firewood and food. Elias worked from before sunrise to long after sunset, his days a testament to grim endurance. He spent hours in the forest, the rhythmic thud of his axe a lonely heartbeat in the vast silence, returning with his shoulders stooped under the weight of felled timber. He tended to his few remaining cattle, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their hides caked with snow. Food grew scarce. The sacks of flour and beans in the corner seemed to shrink with every meal. Elias took to hunting, disappearing into the white woods for hours, often returning with nothing but a fresh layer of exhaustion etched onto his face. Clara could not bear to be a passive observer, another mouth to feed without contributing. She had been a burden long enough. She insisted on helping, on earning her keep in the only ways she knew how. She took over the inside of the cabin, transforming it from a man's sparse shelter into the functioning heart of their small world. She learned to bank the fire at night so a few hot coals remained in the morning, saving them the precious effort of starting it from scratch. She mended Elias's clothes, her needle moving with a skill that was second nature to her, patching the worn flannel of his shirts and reinforcing the seams of his canvas trousers. She took charge of their dwindling food stores, learning to make a thin stew of salted pork and dried beans last for 2 days, to bake biscuits that were dense and filling. But the work was punishing. Her hands, accustomed to the smooth glide of silk and the soft prick of a needle, were not made for this life. The rough handle of the water bucket handle rubbed her palms raw. Splitting kindling left her with a constellation of blisters that broke and bled. Hot water and harsh lye soap, used for scrubbing the floor and washing their clothes, cracked her skin until it wept. She would hide her hands from Elias, clenching them into fists when he was near, ashamed of their weakness, of the constant, stinging pain. They were a map of her own inadequacy. One evening, exhausted from a day of endless chores, she reached for the heavy iron skillet on the stove. Her grip, weakened by fatigue, slipped. The hot handle seared her fingers, and she cried out, dropping the skillet with a deafening clang onto the stone hearth. The pan was empty. Thank God, but the pain was sharp and immediate, a white-hot fire lancing up her arm. It was not just the burn. It was the final straw in a long day of failures, the stark, painful evidence that she did not belong here, that she was more a hindrance than a help. The tears she had been swallowing for days finally came, hot and bitter with frustration. She sank onto a stool, cradling her injured hand, and wept. Elias, who had been oiling a piece of tack by the fire, was on his feet in an instant. He said nothing, but moved to the water bucket, dipped a clean rag into the icy water, and gently took her hand. His touch was surprisingly soft for a man whose own hands were a landscape of scars and calluses. He carefully wrapped the cold, wet cloth around her burned fingers, his movements efficient and sure. "It's not so bad," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Just a blister burn. It will heal." "I'm so clumsy," she sobbed, unable to stop the tears. "I cannot do anything right. My hands, they are useless here." He finished wrapping the cloth, and then, instead of letting go, he turned her hand over in his. His thumb traced the raw, red lines on her palm, the landscape of her pain and effort. His touch was not one of pity, but of a quiet, profound acknowledgement. It lingered for a moment longer than was necessary, a silent communication that passed between them in the flickering firelight. A current of warmth that had nothing to do with the stove and everything to do with the rough, gentle pressure of his hand against hers. He had seen her struggle, and he did not see it as failure. From that day on, Something shifted between them. He began to teach her. His reasons were practical. He knew that in this land, ignorance was a death sentence. If something were to happen to him, she would need to know how to survive. The lessons began with the horses. He taught her not just to sit on a saddle, but to feel the animal's rhythm, to guide it with a gentle pressure of the knees, to trust its instincts. He placed her hands on the reins, his own covering hers, showing her the delicate balance between control and freedom. He taught her how to build a fire in the snow, how to find the driest tinder under the low-hanging boughs of a pine, how to arrange the kindling so the fragile spark could catch and breathe and grow into a life-sustaining flame. And then, one crisp, cold afternoon, he took the rifle down from its pegs. "You need to know how to use this," he said simply. Clara looked at the long, heavy weapon with a deep-seated fear. It was a tool of death, loud and violent. He showed her how to load it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. His body was close behind hers, his arm coming around to guide her aim. His breath warm near her ear as he spoke in a low, steady voice. "Don't fight it. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. Let the rifle become a part of you." The first time she fired it, the recoil slammed into her shoulder. A brutal, shocking force that knocked her back a step. The explosion was deafening, and she missed the tin can he had set on a stump by a wide margin. But he was patient. He corrected her stance, told her to breathe, to be calm. She tried again, and again. On the fourth try, the can jumped into the air with a satisfying ping. A small, surprised smile broke across her face, and Elias answered it with one of his own, a rare, genuine smile that lit his eyes. In the crucible of that harsh winter, through the shared hardship of survival, they grew closer. The small, sparse cabin became their entire world, and in it, the walls Elias had built around his heart began to show cracks. Clara's laughter, which she had thought lost forever, returned. It happened one afternoon as she tried to milk their single cow, who kicked over the bucket for the third time, spattering them both. The absurdity of it, her utter failure, struck her as funny, and a laugh bubbled up from deep inside her, a pure, clear sound that surprised them both. Elias, wiping milk from his cheek, looked at her and shook his head, the ghost of a smile on his lips. He began to speak of his past, not in a flood of confession, but in small, broken fragments offered up in the quiet evenings by the fire. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, how she had loved the wildflowers that grew in the valley in the spring, how she had a laugh that could make a man forget a whole day's trouble. And he spoke of the fire. "I was in town," he said one night, his voice barely a whisper as he stared into the flames. "We were low on flour. I should have been here. The whole place was timber, dry as a bone from the summer heat. It went up so fast." He paused, his throat working. They said she was in the loft, with our boy, Daniel. The floor gave way. I should have been here. I could have gotten them out." The guilt was a raw, open wound in him, as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Clara's heart ached for him. She said nothing, but reached out and put her hand on his arm, her own calloused fingers a testament to the life she now shared with him. He did not pull away. One morning, the world changed. Elias was checking his trap lines at the edge of the forest when he found him. It was not an animal in the trap, but a small boy, huddled in the snow beneath a pine tree, his face blue with cold, his body racked with a weak, silent shivering. He was no more than 5 years old, his clothes little more than rags, his eyes wide and vacant with a terror that went beyond hunger. Elias swept him up in his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing, and carried him back to the cabin. He was an orphan, one of the O'Malley children from a homestead 5 miles up the valley. A traveling fur trapper had brought the news to town a week before. A small band of renegades, driven by winter hunger, had attacked the remote homestead. No one had survived. or so they had thought. The boy, Samuel, must have run and hidden, surviving for days on what they could not imagine. Clara took one look at the child and her heart broke. They stripped off his frozen rags, wrapped him in their warmest blankets, and placed him by the fire. Clara spent hours coaxing him to take sips of warm broth, cradling his frail body, murmuring soft, comforting words. For 2 days, he did not speak, his eyes holding the unspeakable horror he had witnessed. Elias sat by the hearth, watching them, a look of profound pain and tenderness on his face. The presence of a child in the cabin, the ghost of his own lost son, was both a comfort and an agony. Caring for the boy forged a new, deeper bond between them. They were no longer just two people surviving together. They were a unit, a fragile, makeshift family built on a foundation of shared compassion. Samuel's silence finally broke on the 3rd day, when he woke from a nightmare, crying for his mother. Clara held him until he slept again, and when she looked up, Elias was watching her, his eyes filled with an emotion she could not name. Their peace was not to last. A week later, their supplies dangerously low. Elias had no choice but to ride into Red Bluff. He returned just after dusk, his face set like granite. He did not speak as he unloaded the sacks of flour and coffee, but Clara could feel a cold, silent fury radiating from him.
What is it?
She finally asked, her voice trembling.
What happened?
He finally looked at her, his jaw tight. "The town is talking," he said, his voice clipped. "Silas Croft and his friends at the saloon. They have it all figured out. They saw me buying candy for the boy. They say he's mine, and yours. That you were with child when you arrived, and that I took you in to hide your shame." The accusation was so vile, so twisted, that it stole the breath from Clara's lungs. She felt the familiar, hot sting of shame, but this time it was mixed with a furious, protective anger. They were tainting not only her, but Elias and the innocent, grieving child sleeping in the loft. The next morning, against her pleading, Elias rode back to town. He said nothing, but she saw the purpose in his eyes and it terrified her. He returned hours later, just as the snow began to fall again. He stumbled through the door and nearly collapsed. His lip was split. A dark bruise was forming over his left eye, and his knuckles were raw and bloody. A brawl. He had fought them. The quiet, solitary man had met their ugly words with violence. Clara gasped, rushing to his side. She helped him to a chair, her hands trembling as she fetched the water basin and a clean cloth. She said nothing as she gently dabbed at the cut on his lip, her touch feather-light. She cleaned his bloody knuckles, her heart aching with a fierce, painful mix of love and despair. He had defended her honor, his honor, their fragile life together, and had been broken for it. He sat in silence, his head bowed, his breathing ragged. The only sounds in the room were the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of the falling snow against the window pane. When she was done, her hand stilled on his. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. In that instant, the air in the cabin grew thick, charged with all the unspoken words, all the shared hardship, all the carefully suppressed longing of the past months. The distance between them vanished, consumed by a breathless, searing heat that had nothing to do with the fire. His gaze held hers, intense and searching, and in his eyes she saw not just pain and anger, but a raw, unguarded desire that mirrored her own. It was terrifying and beautiful, a precipice on which they both stood, trembling. The snow fell faster outside, blanketing the world, isolating them in the warm, charged silence of the cabin. Clara's voice was a barely audible whisper, thick with tears. "You shouldn't have fought for me." Elias reached up, his bruised hand gently touching her cheek. His eyes never left hers. "There are things worth fighting for," he replied, his voice low and rough with emotion. The winter did not break. It retreated, slowly and grudgingly. fighting for every inch of frozen ground. The thaw came not as a flood, but as a slow, steady drip from the eaves of the cabin, a sound of persistent, quiet hope. The creeks, locked in ice for months, began to murmur and then to roar, their voices returning to the silent valley. Patches of bare, damp earth appeared on the forest floor like promises, and soon after, the first green shoots of wild onion and columbine pushed their way through the leaf litter. The air, for so long sharp and sterile, softened and filled with the rich, living smell of mud and pine sap. The thaw worked its way into the cabin as well. The quiet, watchful tension that had followed the night of Elias's fight slowly melted into a comfortable, domestic rhythm. The unspoken desire that had flared between them settled into a deep, steady warmth, a constant presence that needed no words. They were a family, a strange and wounded little flock composed of a quiet man, a resilient woman, and a silent boy who was slowly learning to trust the world again. Samuel, the orphan they had taken in, began to speak in sentences instead of single words, and one afternoon, Clara heard him laugh for the first time as he watched a squirrel's frantic antics. The sound was like the first birdsong of spring. For Clara, this burgeoning life was a call to action. She was no longer a guest, a refugee from a broken promise. This cabin, this small patch of land carved out of the vast Wyoming wilderness, was her home. She decided it needed a garden. Behind the cabin was a small, sun-drenched patch of ground, rocky and stubborn. With a heavy mattock she found in the lean-to, she began to break the soil. The work was backbreaking. Her hands, now calloused and strong, ached at the end of each day. But it was a good ache, an ache of creation. She cleared the rocks, her own small monuments to persistence, piling them into a low wall. She worked the soil until it was dark and loose, ready for planting. Elias, without a word, brought her a sack of seed potatoes and beans on his next trip from town, leaving it on the porch as a quiet offering. As she pressed the seeds into the cool, damp earth, she felt as though she were planting a part of herself, putting down roots in a place she had never dreamed she would belong. Elias watched her from a distance, a feeling he could not name swelling in his chest. He saw the way she cared for Samuel, her gentle patience. He saw the fierce determination in the set of her jaw as she fought with the rocky soil. He saw the way the cabin had come to life with her presence, the simple meals that tasted of home, the neatly mended clothes, the quiet strength that filled the small space. He had taken her in to save her from the cold, and in doing so, she had unknowingly saved him from the long, frozen winter of his own heart. The ghosts of his wife and son were still with him, but their memory was no longer just a source of pain. It was a part of a life that was, impossibly, beginning again. This new life, however, was fragile, built on a foundation of unspoken assumptions. One morning, he told her he had to ride to Cheyenne on business, that he would be gone for 2, maybe 3 days. He packed his saddlebags, and as he was about to leave, Clara pressed a small, cloth-wrapped package of biscuits into his hand. Their fingers brushed, and for a moment, they stood there in the doorway, the unspoken words hanging between them like motes of dust in the morning light. It felt like a parting between a husband and a wife. Elias's business in Cheyenne was not what she might have imagined. He did not go to the assayer's office or the cattlemen's association. He went to the territorial courthouse, a stark brick building that smelled of dust and dry law books. He sat with a clerk, a small, balding man who peered at him over a pair of spectacles, and had a document drawn up. It was a simple deed of survivorship, a legal paper that stated in its dense, formal language that in the event of his death, a 1/2 interest in his property, the land, the cabin, all of it, would pass to one Clara Whitmore, and the other half to Samuel O'Malley, his ward. He signed his name at the bottom, the ink a dark, final testament to his intent. He was not a man for poetry or promises, but he was a man of action. He had seen what it was for a woman to be left with nothing, and he would not let it happen to her again. He folded the document, placed it in his saddlebag, and rode home, telling her nothing of what he had done. Their peaceful season came to an abrupt end on a bright afternoon in late May. A circuit rider, a wiry man with a dusty coat and a tired horse, stopped by the cabin, a rare visitor from the outside world. He brought with him a single, official-looking letter. It was addressed to Elias, but the man had been instructed to deliver it into the hands of a woman named Clara Whitmore, residing on his property. Clara took the letter, her heart giving a sudden, painful lurch. The envelope was thick, the handwriting on it unfamiliar and severe. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax seal. As she read, the color drained from her face, and the vibrant sounds of the spring day, the bird song, the hum of insects, the rustle of new leaves, faded into a dull, distant roar in her ears. The letter was from a judge in Carbon County. It stated that a formal complaint had been filed by Mr. Walter Hensley, who, having returned to the territory, was now demanding the fulfillment of a marriage contract with one Clara Whitmore, who he claimed had absconded and was now living unlawfully with another man. The past, which she had thought buried under months of snow and a new life, had just crashed through the door of the cabin, bringing with it the cold, biting wind of a winter she thought she had survived. When Elias came in from the woods, he found her sitting at the small table, the letter spread out before her, her face a mask of white, stricken terror.
Clara, what is it?
He asked, his voice sharp with concern.
He is alive,
she whispered, her voice a dry rasp.
Walter Hensley, he has found me.
She pushed the letter across the table. Elias read it, his face betraying nothing, his expression hardening into an unreadable granite slab. But Clara could see the storm gathering in the depths of his eyes, a cold, dangerous fury.
He says I belong to him,
she choked out, a wave of shame and fear making it hard to breathe.
The letters we exchanged, the money he sent for the ticket.
I consulted a lawyer once, in Pennsylvania, before I left. He said that some courts view these arrangements as a binding contract, a promise of marriage, once accepted, can be as good as the vows themselves. Elias, in the eyes of the law, I might be his.
No, Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet.
He placed his hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly, his gaze boring into hers.
That man is a liar and a gambler who abandoned you. He broke whatever promise he made the moment he chose a card game over you. You owe him nothing.
But the law might not see it that way, she cried, her composure finally breaking. They will see a woman who took his money and then ran off to live with another man. They will call me. They will call me things I cannot bear to hear.
Let them, Elias said, his voice a low growl.
This is your home. You are not going anywhere.
His certainty was a rock in the torrent of her fear, but it was not enough to hold back the tide.
3 days later, Sheriff Brody and his deputy rode up to the cabin. The sheriff was a decent man, weary and beholden to his office. He did not look at Clara as he explained, his voice full of gruff apology, that he had a court order. A hearing had been set. Her presence was required. The ride into Red Bluff was the longest journey of Clara's life. She rode the gentle mare Elias had bought for her, her back straight, her head held high, but inside she was crumbling. The townspeople were waiting. Word had spread like a brush fire. They stood on the boardwalks and watched her pass, their faces a mixture of smug vindication and greedy curiosity. The whispers followed her like a cloud of biting flies. There she was, the fallen woman, the mail-order bride, finally being called to account. She felt their eyes on her like a physical blow, stripping her bare. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on Elias's broad back as he rode just ahead of her, a silent, unmovable shield. The courthouse was small and stuffy, packed with every citizen of Red Bluff who could fit inside. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and self-righteousness. At a table near the front sat Walter Hensley.
He was worse than Elias had described. His face was puffy and flushed with drink. His fine clothes were stained and rumpled. And his eyes, which he had once described as being accustomed to long distances, were bloodshot and filled with a venomous spite. He looked at Clara and gave her a slow, proprietary smirk that made her stomach turn. The hearing was a nightmare. Hensley's lawyer, a slick man from Cheyenne, painted Clara as a scheming adventuress. Hensley himself took the stand, his voice slurring slightly as he lied with practiced ease. He claimed he had been called away on urgent business, that he had left word for her, and that he had returned to find his intended bride had been corrupted, that she was living in sin with the very man who now sat beside her. When it was Clara's turn, her legs felt too weak to hold her. Elias gave her hand a quick, hard squeeze under the table, a silent transfer of his own strength. She walked to the stand, her heart hammering. The judge, a stern, gray-bearded man named Miller, looked down at her with cold, impartial eyes. Her voice, when she began to speak, was a mere tremor, but she did not look at the judge, or at the sneering face of Walter Hensley, or at the hostile crowd. She looked at Elias. She saw the fierce, unwavering belief in his eyes, and she found her voice. She told her story, simply and plainly. She spoke of her loneliness in Pennsylvania, of the promises in Hensley's letters. She described her long journey, the hope that had carried her. She recounted the hours she had spent waiting on the frozen train platform, the humiliation, the despair. She told them how Elias had found her, how he had given her his coat, how he had offered her shelter when no one else would. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply told the truth, her gaze never leaving Elias's face. When she finished, a deep silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Miller stared at Hensley for a long, hard moment, his expression one of profound distaste. Mr. Hensley," the judge said, his voice like the crack of a whip. "It is the opinion of this court that you are a scoundrel and a fraud. You lured this woman here under false pretenses and then abandoned her to the elements. A contract cannot be enforced when one party has engaged in such blatant deceit and dereliction. This petition is dismissed. The contract is void." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made Clara faint washed over her. It was over. But the judge was not finished. He turned his severe gaze on her. "However, Miss Whitmore," he continued, his voice ringing with patriarchal authority, "while you may be free of Mr. Hensley, your circumstances have done irreparable damage to your good name by choosing to reside under the roof of an unmarried man. You have flouted the conventions of decent society. Be warned that in the eyes of this community, your reputation is now and will likely remain forever tarnished." It was a victory that felt like a public stoning. She was free, but she was branded a ruined woman. Outside the courthouse, the crowd parted to let them through, their whispers now laced with a fresh dose of scandal. The sky had grown dark, the clouds heavy and bruised-looking, and a low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. They were almost to their horses when a hand shot out and grabbed Clara's arm in a brutal grip. It was Hensley, his face contorted with drunken rage. "You think you can make a fool of me?" he hissed, his foul breath hot on her face. "You are mine. If I cannot have you, I will see to it that no one will. I will ruin you in every town in this territory." Before Clara could even cry out, Elias moved. It was not a conscious thought. It was a pure, primal reaction. He grabbed Hensley's shoulder, spun him around, and drove his fist into the man's face. The sound was a sickening crack of bone and cartilage. Hensley staggered back, blood pouring from his nose. Elias did not stop. His face was a mask of cold, murderous fury, all his suppressed rage unleashed in a terrifying wave. He hit him again, a brutal blow to the jaw that sent Hensley sprawling into the mud. He stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, ready to strike again, to beat the life out of the man who had hurt her, who had shamed her, who had threatened to destroy the fragile peace they had built. He was trembling with a rage so profound it terrified him, and it was only the sight of Clara's horrified face that made him pull back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The townspeople stared in shocked silence. Hensley lay groaning in the street. The storm was closer now, the thunder a deep, angry growl. Clara went to Elias's side, ignoring the blood on his knuckles, ignoring the stares. She put her hand on his trembling arm, her touch grounding him, pulling him back from the precipice. He looked at her, his eyes wild and filled with the horror of his own violence. She looked from his bruised knuckles to his anguished face, and then at the ruined man in the mud. She looked at the judgmental faces of the town that had branded her. She was ruined. In their eyes, she would always be. But she was not alone. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, she leaned in close, her voice a soft, fierce whisper meant only for him. "If I'm ruined," she said, her gaze clear and unwavering, "let me be ruined beside you." Her words hung in the rain-soaked air between them, a vow spoken in the face of public ruin. Elias looked at her, the wild fury in his eyes softening into a look of raw, aching wonder. He reached out with his good hand and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin as if to reassure himself she was real. He did not need to speak. In his touch, in the fierce, protective light of his gaze, she had her answer. The thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting in two, and the rain began to fall in earnest, a cold, cleansing torrent that washed the blood and the dust from the street, plastering their hair to their skin and soaking them to the bone in seconds. Elias took her hand, his grip firm and unwavering, and led her to the horses. They mounted and rode out of Red Bluff, leaving the shocked town, the whispers, and the groaning figure of Walter Hensley behind them, swallowed by the storm. The ride back to the cabin was a battle against the elements. The wind tore at them, a physical force that tried to push them from their saddles. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the familiar path into a treacherous river of mud. Every flash of lightning bleached the world in a stark, skeletal white, followed by a clap of thunder so immediate and violent it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was as if the fury Elias had unleashed in town had been answered by the sky, the heavens themselves raging in sympathy. They reached the relative shelter of the cabin, drenched and shivering, the ordeal of the day having given way to a fight for survival against the storm's raw power. Inside, with a fire roaring in the hearth and Samuel sleeping soundly in the loft, a fragile peace settled. But the storm was not finished with them. It clawed at the small cabin, a wild beast trying to get in. Sometime after midnight, a sound unlike any other ripped through the constant roar of the wind and rain, a deafening, explosive crack, as if a great celestial tree had been felled. It was followed instantly by an unnatural, flickering orange light that pulsed against the cabin's single window. Elias was on his feet before the sound had fully faded. "The barn," he said, his voice a grim, hollow whisper. He threw the door open, and the sight that met them was an image from hell. The old, dry-timbered barn, which stood 100 yards from the cabin, was engulfed in flames. A bolt of lightning had struck the roof, and the fire, fed by dry hay and fanned by the gale-force winds, was consuming it with a terrifying hunger. The roar of the blaze was a living thing, and silhouetted against it were the panicked, frantic shapes of the cattle that had scattered from their lean-to. "Stay here! Lock the door!" Elias yelled at her over the din, his face illuminated in the ghastly light. He grabbed a heavy axe from beside the door and plunged out into the maelstrom. Clara stood frozen for a single, heart-stopping second, his command echoing in her ears. "Stay here! Be safe!" But as she watched him run toward that wall of fire, a fierce, primal instinct rose up in her, stronger than fear, stronger than reason. Her place was not here, in the safety of the cabin. Her place was with him. Everything they had, everything they were, was in that fire. Without a second thought, she pulled her wet shawl tighter around her head and ran after him,
the thick, sucking mud trying to pull the shoes from her feet. The heat was a solid wall, striking her from 20 yards away. The air was thick with smoke that burned her lungs and made her eyes stream. Elias was already working with a desperate, focused energy, using the axe to smash the wooden gate of the small corral, driving the terrified cattle out and away from the spreading flames.
"Clara, I told you to stay back,"
he roared, his face a mask of soot and fury when he saw her.
"The horses!"
She screamed back, pointing toward the stable section of the barn, where the roof was not yet fully ablaze, but from which the terrified screams of an animal could be heard.
"Your gelding is still inside."
There was no time to argue. He gave her a single, hard look, a look of fear, of anger, but also of acknowledgement, and then nodded. Together, they ran toward the yawning, fiery mouth of the stable. The smoke was a thick, blinding curtain. Embers rained down around them like malevolent fireflies. Inside, the scene was chaos. A heavy crossbeam, burning at both ends, had fallen, blocking the entrance to the stall where Elias's horse, Old Ben, was trapped, rearing and kicking in sheer terror. Working as one, their movements frantic but synchronized, they heaved against the heavy timber. The wood was scorching hot, searing their hands, but they did not let go. "Now!" Elias grunted, and with a final, desperate shove, they moved the beam just enough for the horse to squeeze through. Elias grabbed the halter, pulling and calming the panicked animal, while Clara slapped its flank, driving it out into the relative safety of the rain-drenched night. They stumbled out of the stable, gasping for air, their faces black with soot. For a moment, they thought they were safe, but then came a terrible groan from the heart of the fire, the sound of a giant beast in its death throes. Clara looked up in horror. The main roof of the barn, a great, flaming skeleton of timber, was beginning to buckle.
"Elias, look out!"
she screamed. He turned, his eyes widening as he saw the collapsing structure. He shoved her hard, sending her stumbling backward into the mud, out of the direct path of the fall. But he was too late to save himself. With a deafening crash, the roof caved in, bringing down a cascade of fire, smoke, and heavy, burning timbers, and Elias disappeared beneath it.
"Elias!"
The name was torn from her throat, a raw, ragged shriek of pure terror. She scrambled through the mud, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes had just seen. She found him at the edge of the wreckage, half buried under a heavy, smoldering beam, his head bleeding, his body unnervingly still. The fire raged just feet away, its heat so intense it felt like it was peeling the skin from her face. A strength she never knew she possessed surged through her. She was no longer a city seamstress with delicate hands. She was a woman fighting for the life of the man she loved. She dug her fingers into the mud and heaved at the heavy beam, her muscles screaming in protest. It didn't budge. She tried again, sobbing his name, her voice raw and broken. "Elias, please!" With a final, adrenaline-fueled surge, she put her entire body into it, and the timber shifted, just enough for her to drag him free. He was a dead weight. She hooked her arms under his and pulled, dragging him backward through the mud and the driving rain, away from the inferno, her heart hammering with a single, desperate prayer. He awoke to pain, a dull, throbbing ache in his head, a sharp, searing fire along his arm and shoulder, and a deep, bruising soreness that seemed to inhabit every bone in his body. The world came into focus slowly. He was in the cabin, in his own bed. The storm had passed. A gentle, gray light filtered through the window. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire. He turned his head, a groan escaping his lips, and saw her. Clara was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head slumped forward, her exhaustion absolute. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair tangled and damp. Her hands rested in her lap, and he could see they were raw, blistered, and bloody from her efforts to save him.
The sight of those hands, her hands, ruined in his service, sent a wave of emotion through him, so powerful it was a physical pain, sharper than any of his burns. She had run into the fire for him. She had pulled him from the wreckage. She had saved his life. He reached out his good hand and lightly touched her arm. Her eyes fluttered open instantly, clouded with sleep for a moment, and then clearing with a sudden, sharp intake of breath.
"Elias,"
she whispered, her voice thick with relief. "You are awake." "Clara," he said, his own voice a hoarse rasp. He looked at her ruined hands, then back to her face. All the fear, all the hardship, all the unspoken longing of the past months culminated in that single, desperate moment. The fire had burned away the last of their restraints, the last of their hesitations.
"I thought I had lost you."
She wept, her tears falling freely now, tracing clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. She took his hand in both of her raw ones, holding on as if he were an anchor in a raging sea. He pulled her gently closer, until her head was resting on the pillow beside his. "You saved me," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years.
"I love you, Elias,"
she confessed, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I think I have loved you since the moment you put your coat around me." "And I you," he answered, his own voice breaking. He tilted her chin up, his gaze searching hers, and in her eyes he saw his own desperate, tender love reflected back at him. Their pain, their fear, and their relief melted into a kiss that was not gentle, but fierce with the desperation of those who have faced death and chosen life. It was a trembling, passionate confession, a claiming and a surrender all at once, a promise sealed in the quiet, fire-lit aftermath of the storm. Their peace was a fragile, fleeting thing. By the next evening, Elias's injuries began to declare their true, serious nature. The burns on his arm and shoulder, angry and red, began to weep. A deep, racking cough settled in his chest from the smoke he had inhaled. And then the fever came. It started with a violent shivering that shook the bed frame, and then progressed to a burning heat that left him drenched in sweat, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Clara fought the fever with a fierce, relentless desperation. For days and nights that blurred into one long, terrifying vigil. She did not sleep. She kept the fire stoked, brewed bitter willow bark tea to fight the inflammation, and constantly bathed his burning skin with cool water. She whispered prayers until her voice was hoarse. Prayers to a God she was not sure was listening, but she prayed all the same. She would not lose him. She could not. On the third day, the fever worsened. He began to drift, lost in a delirium that took him far away from her, back to a place of older, deeper pain. He tossed and turned, his hands clutching at the blankets, his voice a low, agonized murmur.
"Sarah?"
he mumbled, his eyes staring at a point on the ceiling only he could see.
"The smoke! I cannot see! Daniel, where is the boy?"
His breath came in ragged sobs.
"I am sorry. I am so sorry. I should have been here. Forgive me."
Clara knelt by the bed, her own tears falling onto his sweat-soaked skin. He was trapped in the inferno that had claimed his family, begging for a forgiveness the dead could not give. His pain was so profound, so absolute. It was a physical presence in the room. She knew then that the willow bark was not enough. She needed real medicine, quinine from the apothecary in town, something to break the fever's grip, but she had no money left. Her eyes fell on the small wooden box on the mantel, the box where she kept her few possessions. Inside was the simple, gold-plated wedding band Walter Hensley had sent her in one of his last letters, a cheap, false promise of a life that had never existed. It was the last relic of her old life, a symbol of her shame and foolishness. Without hesitation, she took it. She wrapped it in a small piece of cloth, pulled on Elias's heavy sheepskin coat, and stepped out into the mud-choked world. The walk to Red Bluff was an odyssey. The river had crested its banks, and the path was a treacherous bog that tried to claim her shoes with every step. She pushed on, driven by a singular purpose. She reached the town, a muddy, wild-eyed apparition, and went straight to the apothecary. She traded the ring to old Dr. Evans without a word of explanation, taking the precious bottle of quinine and a packet of powders in return. The ring bought her more than medicine, it bought her hope. She returned to the cabin as dusk was falling, exhausted but resolute. She forced the bitter medicine between Elias's lips, drop by drop, all through that long night. She sat by his side, bathing his face, holding his hand, and whispering to the ghosts that haunted him. As he thrashed in his delirium, calling out for his wife, begging for forgiveness, she leaned close to his ear, her tears falling on his cheek. "You could not save them," she whispered, her voice breaking with love and sorrow. "But you saved me. You have already saved me. Elias, let me save you now." She repeated the words over and over, a litany, an absolution, and as the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the window, she felt a change. The violent shivering subsided. The burning heat of his skin began to cool. He fell into a deep, peaceful, natural sleep. The fever had broken. The world outside was quiet, washed clean by the storm. The sun rose into a sky of pale blue and soft rose, its light spilling over the wet, glistening fields. Later that morning, weak and bruised but clear-eyed for the first time in days, Elias sat on the porch steps, a blanket wrapped around him. Clara came and sat beside him, and without a word, he draped his old sheepskin coat, the one that had started it all, around her shoulders. They sat together in the quiet morning, watching the sunlight chase the last of the shadows from the valley, the light from the new day glowing like a promise against the vast, wild land. The summer that followed was a season of healing. It was a time of long, sun-drenched days and quiet, star-filled nights. The land itself, washed clean by the storm, seemed to offer up its bounty with a renewed vigor. The small garden Clara had planted behind the cabin flourished, its green rows of beans and potatoes a testament to her patient, hopeful labor. Elias's burn scarred over, leaving a latticework of pale, new skin on his arm and shoulder, a permanent reminder of the fire that had almost taken him, but had instead forged them together. They worked side by side, their days falling into a rhythm as natural and steady as the turning of the earth. They were building a life, not with grand words or promises, but with the quiet, daily accumulation of shared tasks and small, unspoken kindnesses. The orphan boy, Samuel, thrived in the steady warmth of their care. The haunted, vacant look in his eyes was replaced by the bright, curious gaze of a child. He followed Elias everywhere, mimicking the way he walked, the way he carried an axe. He sat with Clara in the evenings, listening as she read to him from one of Elias's few books, his head resting against her shoulder. The cabin, once a bastion of solitude and grief, was now filled with the sound of a boy's questions and, sometimes, the miracle of his laughter. They were a family, not one born of blood or law, but one forged in the crucible of shared hardship, compassion, and a quiet, tenacious love. The town of Red Bluff watched them from a distance. Acceptance, when it came, was not a sudden revelation but a slow, grudging tide turning. The whispers did not cease overnight. They simply faded, starved of the scandal they had once fed on. The townsfolk saw Elias, his face bruised and his knuckles scarred from the fight, working his land with a renewed purpose. They saw Clara, her hands no longer soft but strong and capable, her face no longer pale with fear but browned by the sun and filled with a quiet, unshakable strength. They saw a woman who had been abandoned and ruined stand up and, with sheer force of will, build a home from the ashes of her life. The change was measured in small gestures. One afternoon, widow Martha James, who had once warned Elias of the ruin Clara would bring, appeared at the edge of their property. She did not speak, but simply left a basket of fresh eggs on a fence post before turning and walking away. When Elias went to the mercantile for supplies, Silas Croft, the man who had led the gossips and whose jaw still bore the mark of Elias's fist, tipped his hat in a gesture of gruff, reluctant respect. People began to see not the scandal, but the story, a story of decency, of loyalty, of two broken people who had, against all odds, managed to make each other whole. One afternoon late in the summer, a lone rider, a surveyor passing through on his way to the Dakotas, stopped in town for a drink. He saw Clara loading sacks of flour into the back of Elias's wagon. He squinted, his memory stirring. "I know you," he said, approaching her with a frank curiosity. "You were that woman at the train station. Last winter. The mail-order bride who got left. I was here that day. I didn't think you'd last here." Clara paused, pushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked at the man, a ghost from a life that felt 1,000 years ago. The memory of that day, the cold, the humiliation, the utter despair, was still a scar on her soul, but it no longer had the power to wound her. She gave him a faint, quiet smile, a smile that held all the hardship and all the triumph of the months between then and now. "Neither did I," she said. "The first project of the autumn was to build a new barn. The charred, skeletal remains of the old one served as a constant, grim reminder of the night they had almost lost everything." Elias worked with a silent, focused intensity, felling trees and hewing the logs with his own hands. Clara helped, dragging the timbers, mixing the mud and straw for the chinking. Her movements strong and sure. They raised the frame together, a monument not to what they had lost, but to what they were building. It was a structure of hope, its clean pine scent a promise of security, its sturdy roof a shield against the winters to come. One evening, after the barn was finished, Clara found Elias sitting by the hearth, a small block of wood and his carving knife in his hands. He worked in the quiet, flickering firelight, the shavings falling like soft snow onto the floor. When he was done, he showed her what he had made, a small, simple wooden cross, beautifully carved from a piece of seasoned oak. He stood and, with a reverence that made the small cabin feel like a cathedral, he found a place on the stone mantel of the hearth, a space that had been empty for years. He set the cross there, a quiet, final tribute to the wife and son he had lost in the fire, a peace offering to the ghosts of his past. He stood looking at it for a long moment, his face full of a deep, sorrowful peace. Then he turned back to the fire, picked up another block of wood, and began to carve again. The second cross was identical to the first. He placed it right beside the other one, a silent, powerful declaration for the family he had found. On a crisp Sunday morning in October, they went to church. It was the first time they had gone as a family. As they walked down the central aisle of the small, unadorned chapel, a hush fell over the congregation. Every eye was upon them. Elias, his face clean-shaven and solemn, his best shirt neatly pressed. Clara, in her simple blue dress, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, and Samuel, walking between them, his small hand clutching one of each of theirs. They did not look like a scandal. They looked like a family. They took their place in an empty pew, and as the preacher began to speak, Clara saw the people around them, one by one, turn and give them a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a quiet, collective gesture of respect, a final, unspoken welcome into the fold of the community. They had earned their place. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the valley, Elias spoke to her in a low voice. "Let's take a walk." He did not have to say where they were going. He helped her into the old, worn sheepskin coat, the one he had first placed around her shoulders on a cold, desperate night that now seemed a lifetime ago. They walked hand in hand, Samuel having been left in the care of a willing widow James,
and made their way back to the place where their story had begun. The train station was deserted, the platform empty under the vast, darkening sky. The wind that swept across it was cold, carrying the first sharp bite of the coming winter. A few stray snowflakes, the first of the season, began to drift down from the gray clouds, melting as they touched the weathered wood. It was the same platform, the same cold wind, the same feeling of a world poised on the edge of a long, deep freeze, but everything was different. This time, Clara was not alone. She was wrapped in the familiar, comforting warmth of his coat, its scent of leather and wood smoke the scent of home. His hand, strong and calloused, was holding hers, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor against the cold. She leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the endless tracks that disappeared into the twilight. "You remember?" she whispered, the words a soft plume of vapor in the cold air. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the bench where he had first seen her, a small, shivering bundle of misery. "I remember," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "You were shivering. I didn't know then that I'd never let you go again." In the distance, a mournful whistle blew, and a few moments later, the evening train appeared, its single headlight cutting a bright, lonely path through the dusk. It thundered past the station, a rushing, roaring blur of smoke and steam and steel, its passing a violent, momentary disruption of the evening's peace. It was a reminder of the vast, indifferent world that lay beyond their small valley. A world of journeys and arrivals, of lonely people searching for a place to rest. They stood together, unmoving, as the last car vanished into the darkness and the sound faded, leaving only the whisper of the wind. The snowflakes began to fall thicker now, clinging to their hair and shoulders, but this time, they did not feel cold. They felt like a gentle benediction, each one a small, white promise of the quiet, peaceful winter they would face together. They were not alone. He turned to her, his eyes full of a love as vast and as quiet as the landscape around them. And she smiled. They began the long walk home, their footprints falling side by side in the gathering snow. A single, shared path leading them away from the desolate platform and toward the warm, golden light that glowed in the distance. It was the light from their cabin, a small, steady beacon of hope and home, shining like a promise against the vast, wild dark. Thank you for listening, and we encourage you to comment with where you're listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.